You know, one of the successes in growing tomatoes is proper pruning and staking. And the reason that we really want to prune tomatoes to begin with are because of some of the different varieties. For example, this variety is what we call an indeterminate. That means it will continue to have a central leader that will grow and get as tall as it can possibly go until we stop pruning it or taking care of it, or even until the freeze. Actually, a tomato would grow as a perennial in Oklahoma if it wasn't for our cold winters. The ones beside it are what we call determinate varieties, and that means that they'll reach a certain point and the growing tip will stop, so they're a squattier plant and they really don't require staking or pruning. So that's the reason that we want to go in and do some pruning. Now I'll come down to this end and I'll kind of explain this first pruning system to you. What we've done is put in some fence posts on each end and one in the center, and we put a wire across the top for a little bit of security. We've ran some baling twine down at an angle on this first plant, wrapped it around the stem, and came back up and met at the top. Now this is an idea I got from a Mr. Offit over in Brushy Mountain Orchard near Salisaw, who's growing some tomatoes. And he said that he gets a lot of production and has seen this done commercially. So what we've done is we've pruned off some of the suckers, and we'll actually form 2 branches on these strings going up to the top. So we thought it'd be fun just to try and see. Now his spacing is a little bit different from ours. We put our plants a little bit closer, so this plant in between, we just ran 1 string down to the center and tied it on. Now you've got to be very careful, because as the tomato plant grows, it will grow in circumference, and we can girdle the stems if we're not careful. So we'll keep an eye on that to make sure that that doesn't happen. As the plants grow up, we'll tie them to our string and just prune them and train them right up the string. And again, we'll let you know how that goes. Now another example that you have seen on Oklahoma gardening is using cattle panels. Now, we've just put in the fence post again, attached the cattle panels up off of the ground so we didn't puncture our black plastic. And these plants have not been pruned yet, but we will come in and prune off some of the suckers. Now you could weave them in between the panels, but I think you're taking a little bit of a chance, and possibly they could snap off if you're not careful. So what we'll do is, as they grow up, we'll just tie them to the panel and stake them that way. Now another common practice of training them is actually putting them in some concrete reinforcement cages. And we've got some that are very tall. We've put the pointed ends up towards the top because we didn't want to puncture our mulch again. And we've put in some rebar in the center where we've attached the wire to hold the cages so they don't blow over. This particular row we're not even going to prune. We're just going to allow the plants to grow, keep them in the cages, and see what kind of production. And that's a common one used in a lot of home gardens. The last one that I want to show you is one that really is done on a commercial basis. It's done in a lot of the commercial production fields in Oklahoma, Arkansas, even in Florida. And that's just using some stakes that are put maybe every 3 to 4 plants. And this reason for doing this is because it's a little bit more inexpensive. The stakes are cheaper than the rebar and the cattle panels and that kind of thing. But what I want to show you before we do that is some pruning, because we've talked about it, but we really haven't told you why. Pruning is done by removing suckers, and suckers are the growth that comes out of the axis of a leaf. And here's our leaf coming out, and here's one of the suckers just starting to grow. Now that's really the time that you would want to prune them, when they're smaller, and you just pop them out of there. Commercially, they'll come in and maybe remove the first 2 or 3 suckers. This is a sucker. If you'll look, we need to remove that one, as well as this one over here. And so those are some big ones, and you don't want to wait this long, because actually it will have a little more damage and tear the plant. Another one over here, so we've removed at least 4 suckers to get a central growing point to begin with. And you can see there's a big difference now in what we've taken out of there. Now, if you want to start some transplants for your neighbors, once you cut those suckers off, one about this size, you can take that bottom leaf off, stick it in some sand or well-drained potting soil, and root another plant, starch another plant. And that may be a way to start some new transplants for later in the summer. But once we've got those first few suckers pruned off, And again, we won't do any more pruning on them now that we've removed 3 or 5. You tie your baling twine again to that stake, and you just go down this one side of your plants. And this is about the height that you put your first one on. Wrap it once around your post. Again, just keep going down the side. And as you can imagine, this is hand done commercially, so it's very labor intense. And then once we get to the next post, we'll wrap it again, once around, and then come right on down the side again. Once we get to the end, you'll wrap it several times, and then we'll come back down this side and we'll tie it off at the other end just like we did. So we've got twine on each side of our plant. And then as these grow, we'll come back probably 2 to 3 times and tie them up again as they grow up with the stakes. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why do you want to go to all that trouble to stake them? You could just let them grow on the ground, not do any pruning, but the problem is you get a lot of disease that way with the fruit. A lot of dirt splashes up on them, and they found that if you'll prune them, you'll get earlier production and pretty good sized fruit, maybe even larger fruit. But the production doesn't go as long into the season, where if you leave them without pruning them, you'll get a lot of smaller fruit, but they'll produce throughout the season a lot longer. But again, you may get bigger yields on those, but the fruit may not be as big. So again, it really is up to you what you can come up with in your garden, but try to do a little bit of pruning this year and staking and see what kind of results you get.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.